Yeah, so Alondra, whenever you're ready.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Here we go. I'm just going to share the screen first. So everyone can hear me well? Yeah? All right, perfect. Hello, my name is Alondra Ruiz-Hernández, and I'm a cross-disciplinary artist. And I'm grateful to be sharing this time with you to talk about the death and rebirth process, as the name of my port talk implies, as well as my artistic process and how my latest artwork began to focus on transformation. So all the images I am presenting are part of my own body of artwork. In some sections, I will be talking about the artistic process and materials, while at other times I will focus on the concept and the ideas driving my present work. So the way that I have organized this talk is that there will be moments that the words will act to support the artwork, and sometimes my images will support the words. At the present moment, death is in the foreground for much of humanity. Usually it lurks in the depths of our psyches, but during the current COVID-19 pandemic, it can no longer hide. Memento Mori, a Latin phrase meaning remember you must die, is a tradition of paintings popularized in the 17th century. These Memento Mori paintings usually consisted of skulls, decaying fruits, flowers, hourglasses, all depicting the fragility of life. These were made during a deeply religious time. Now, my Memento Mori is a contemporary interpretation, as I believe all human beings go through the process of many different types of deaths. My Memento Mori is originally a self-portrait photograph, which is intensely photoshopped, adding wrinkles, fruits, gray hairs, and dramatic lighting. I aged my skin, tinting and staining every corner carefully. Life is not the opposite of death, birth is. But along the pathway to death, we create our own stories and personalities. Personality comes from the Greek word persona, meaning it is some sort of mask. Death doesn't just consist of the destruction of the physical body, one we all know, but also of the deconstruction of mythological and psychological selves. These are deaths and rebirths that occur within an individual's psyche. As the Jungian analyst Robert A. Johnson puts it, often when new growth occurs, the most dreadful things seem to happen. But then, when we see that it is exactly what was required, it is easy to be optimistic after the fact, but it is devilishly painful while it is happening. There is a sort of evolutionary, inner chaotic warfare. This warfare is rooted in the old part of our brain, which is desperately trying to survive. One must symbolically let these parts of ourselves die so that we can live in new ways. This new form of existence may even revitalize our emotions. The poet David White wrote, "Our faces would fall away until we, growing younger towards death every day, growing younger towards death every day, would gather all our flaws in celebration, would gather all our flaws in celebration." Transformation almost always occurs from outside our comfort zone. The myth of Psyche and Eros sheds light on the psychological processes that may occur when one is confronted with this change. Mourning, leading to the death or letting go of, and finally, rebirth. Robert A. Johnson explains in his novels that legends and myths are almost always synonymous with falsehood or illusion. This is because of a misguided idea that myths are a childish way ancient humans had of explaining natural phenomena, that science explains so much better. But certain psychologists and anthropologists have helped us understand that mythology reflects the underlying psychological and spiritual processes that is taking place in a human psyche. Furthermore, myths are a rich source of psychological insight. Great literature, like all great art, records and portrays the human condition with indelible accuracy. Myths are a special kind of literature, not written or created by a single individual, but produced by the imagination and experiences of an entire age and culture, and can be seen as the distillation of those dreams and experiences of a whole culture. So, stepping away from the myth for a moment, I have been extremely fortunate in my life to find a brilliant mentor and guide, and actually a former Good Enough member, who I really think is one of the most intelligent human beings I have ever met, Bea Gonzalez, who in her group, Sophia Cycles, introduced me to the rich world of archetypal myths, but also taught me about philosophy, psychology, and ideas of Carl Jung. I'm also extremely fortunate to have a supportive family, loving sisters, a mother who has introduced me to the world of psychology and spirituality, and a father who has politically inspired me. So in this talk, I am drawing from knowledge from individuals far wiser than I. One thing I have learned is that if an individual is not willing to dig deep into their own psychology and confront what is needed to be confronted, they will often unconsciously find other people or circumstances which force them to do so. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the myth of Psyche and Eros, Psyche was said to be such a beautiful young girl, her beauty was comparable to the goddess of Aphrodite. The goddess, upset with this comparison to a mere mortal, condemned Psyche to be destined to marry death. The goddess sends her son, Eros, or who is more commonly known as Cupid, to pierce Psyche when she meets the god of death. However, Eros accidentally pricks himself upon seeing her and immediately falls in love. In an attempt to hide his love from his mother, he takes Psyche to a secret paradise garden. Eros tells Psyche to wear a blindfold whenever he is around so that she will never know who he is. So it's important to know that myths contain archetypes rather than any real people or scenarios, which catalyze change and growth. So every character presented in the story could be understood and analyzed as different parts that make up one individual's psychology. Here, I understand this stage of the myth as an individual in the process of change, but who isn't fully conscious. A part of Psyche's own psychology is still hidden from her conscious awareness. She keeps this symbolic blindfold to something that she isn't quite ready to see and to integrate into her life. Psyche's sisters visit her in her new home. Upon discovering that secret that Psyche is keeping, they urge her to uncover her husband's identity. After all, she could be married to a monster. So these sisters that come into her life could very well be Psyche's inner doubts, but they could also be other individuals that enter her life and propel change. And I think that this is a very healthy way to think of individuals or situations that bring personal difficulties, while at the same time stimulate transformation. We can pause for a moment, take a step back, through these tough and strenuous moments in the pandemic and ask yourselves, where have you expanded and where have you transformed? It is paradoxical, but you can feel both gratitude and resentment towards the person who forces you to begin down your path of growth. Psyche begins her journey, moving through the fog into deeper clarity. As her husband sleeps, she takes her lantern and knife to uncover his identity. Although she discovers something beautiful, no monster at all, she is in shock and drops of oil from her lantern fall onto Eros' arms, waking him up. I think this moment in our myth points to a reality of what change is. Sometimes, despite us knowing that whatever development is occurring would in fact be a positive one, can hold on to a tremendous amount of fear. Fear because it means stepping outside of the world and tendencies you've always known. As the blindfolded agreement between Eros and Psyche is broken, Psyche is suddenly sent back to Earth after being in paradise. Perhaps here is another insight to growth. Psyche confronts that aspect of her psychology that she has long been hiding from herself and immediately returns to Earth. But isn't this how growth happens for so many of us? It isn't really a linear thing, but rather a circular movement where we take a few steps into a deeper consciousness, finally understand what it is we are meant to see, get a little freaked out, return to our old habits, to what we know is safe, and then when we are ready, we take a few steps forward. During Psyche's time on Earth, being completely overwhelmed from the knowledge that she has just unveiled, immediately wants to drown herself in a river. As Johnson highlights, does this not point towards a kind of self-sacrifice, the relinquishing of one level of consciousness for another? Quite often in human experience, the urge towards suicide signals an edge of a new level of consciousness, if you can kill the right thing, the old way of adaptation, and not to actually injure yourself. A new energy era will begin. Any pathway we choose in life will inevitably lead to some form of heartbreak. However, heartbreak is a symbol of genuine care. The poet David Whyte explains so many visions of our future are adolescent hopes of escape from the present, especially from the heartbreak of the present. Really, you only have a future when you come into the heartbreak and the ground of this life. In the midst of Psyche's pain, she is visited by the god Pan. The god Pan is where we derive the word panic from. And she gets the understanding that she must go to Aphrodite to move beyond the pain. This is frustrating because it is Aphrodite who condemned her to marry death to begin with. But as Johnson points out, it is almost always the case that whatever has wounded you will be instrumental to your healing. Although it might be natural to run away, distract ourselves, and place our own metaphorical blindfold when we encounter difficulties, it doesn't resolve the pain or truly allow you to move forward. Avoidance only causes the pain to live and be active somewhere else in the back of our minds. As the writer Thomas Hübl explains, if we don't look at our past, the past will look through us. This notion of personal freedom is an illusion. We have personal freedom and choice only when we are conscious of what we are choosing. If my pattern runs me, then I don't have a choice. If there are unconscious drivers in my experience that I am unaware of, then those unconscious mechanisms will run me. Unconscious trauma of our past is our destiny, but conscious energy brings in a choice. The rest of our myth consists of Aphrodite giving Psyche a series of tasks that will propel her to transform. At each stage of change, Psyche feels the urge towards death, and in fact, a part of her does die, an old perception or habit that no longer works. And she stumbles through the exhausting process of letting go of the past and allowing what is new in, until finally, she is reborn. We all go through this death and rebirth process at some point in our lives. And if we are lucky, hopefully not once, but a few times. For the past few years, my practice has been focused on trauma, specifically a sense of global trauma, which I will revisit later on. First, I want to dive into what trauma actually is. Psychotherapist and pioneer in sensory motor psychotherapy, Pat Ogaden, explains that psychological trauma is a unique individual experience of an event, a series of events, or a set of enduring conditions in which an individual's ability to integrate his or her emotional experience is overwhelmed. Trauma specialist Bezel van der Kolk explains that our sense of aliveness is based on our body's sensations. And when trauma occurs, the individual has a heartbreaking and gut-wrenching sensation that leads to the shutdown of your own body, and to ignore, to push away those feelings that are very much in the insula and parietal brain leads you to start feeling dead. Your life no longer has meaning. You have no self-compassion, and you certainly have no compassion for other people. The sensation of death seems to be inseparable from trauma, either as a byproduct of the event itself or when an individual attempts to feel more aware and less dissociated. The sensation occurs because you are actively fighting the brain circuits that are wired to protect you from being vulnerable again. Although this protective defense mechanism may not always manifest itself in the most logical ways. Even if you feel that you have not experienced a traumatic event yourself, Western society places higher value on thoughts than feelings. The result is a cortical-centric orientation in which there is a top-down bias, emphasizing thoughts over feelings and minimizing the bottom-up feeling emanating from our bodies. This leads to the same dead sensation. We need to deconstruct the colonial thoughts, preferences, and values that form a sort of allegiance to the rational mind. I do not intend to dismiss the rational, nor the incredible discoveries that the rational mind allows for and nurtures. However, this allegiance materializes a divided mind, where the rational is held in far greater importance over the emotional. If we neglect our emotional well-being, it leads not only to difficult, unnecessary suffering for other individuals but also for future individuals and for us to traumatize future generations. As van der Kolk explains, to overcome trauma, you need to wake up your body again, where you can really take pleasure in the small things of life. Perhaps part of being fully alive is to simultaneously hold the world's agony and ecstasy. In valuing this essential aspect of life, we can reconnect to our own well-being and empathize and care for the well-being of others. we have to embrace our connectivity with all sentient beings. This will permit for the connection between the inner and outer worlds. Vulnerability comes from the Latin word vulnus, or wound. The poet David Whyte writes and urges his readers to cultivate vulnerability, which he says is not a weakness, but rather a vehicle for compassion. Whyte explains that the notion of the wound is a symbol of being open to the world, whether you like it or not. So these paintings belong to a body of work named Collective Trauma. They attempt to visually manifest trauma through the notion of the rupture. The pieces exhibit different expressions of punctures through either an illusionary form, the oil and digitally painted, or in analog form, the physical burnt tear. Each piece retains patterning and vibrant myriad colors in the midst of the ruptures, symbolizing the beauty of hope which lies beneath the trauma. This triptych of paintings portraying the brain's defense mechanisms: fight, flight, and freeze. So this painting is called Fight, and this painting exhibits the most chaotic manifestations out of the three. The intricate designs overlap and leave no room for your eyes to rest, echoing the restlessness in a fight response. Fight shows the emotional panic that leads to the state of hypervigilance, defensiveness, and preparedness where everything is perceived as dangerous. Flight exhibits a physical, analog, painted, and digital spaces. During the process, I took an image and I ripped that image, scanned the cut, printed and attached the image of the new formed cut on and placed it onto a canvas and then painted on top of that. So, for example, if you look at the right upper corner, the fold is a painted illusionary form. Whereas if you look at the left upper corner, that is an actual physical fold from the printed paper. The main tear is an illusionary effect. So the idea here was to really play with the illusion of space and how perceptions can be distorted. In this painting, the more vibrant designs lie beneath the rupture and sit in a more hidden position. This is because defense mechanism of flight is the mind's attempt to escape the overwhelming situation. While flight presents an illusionary digital tear, freeze presents a physical burnt puncture. So here I actually ripped and burnt the canvas. The act of burning the canvas physically traumatizes the material itself. Freeze happens when fight or flight are not possible. The overwhelming white of the canvas is flat, motionless, achromatic, lifeless environment that reflects an extremely low energy and submission that prevails during the states of hypoarousal. Like the fight, flight, freeze triptych, the painting Collective Psyche also expresses these defense mechanisms through illusionary and physical punctures. In the painting Collective Psyche, these defense stages overlap, moving through the body of a canvas and exposing the skeletal structure underneath. I built a composite canvas by attaching multiple frames together, displaying a fragmented piece.
When you're close to GC, just give me a call.
mimicking what trauma expert Janina Fisher explains, when more than one trauma happens, the right brain-dominated traumatized part of the self becomes more compartmentalized. Separate parts evolve, each offering different survival strategies needed in a dangerous world. They fear normal life as dangerous and fight to survive in their old ways. Can we draw parallels between an individual traumatized brain and our collective traumatized psyche? In the 1960s, the Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan described the world as a global village that would continue to shrink as technological development evolved. The global village is a notion of transnationalism. So it's interactions, interests, and loyalties beyond the tribe and nation that encompass the globe. The distinctive character of the global village is that it is based on communication, and it assumes that global information creates global consciousness. McLuhan compares the interconnected communication networks to a global nervous system. Extending on this analogy, it could be concluded that, like any other consciousness, this system could also experience trauma and react accordingly. Can our current socio-political context, specifically the COVID-19 pandemic, migrant and climate crisis, be considered byproducts or exacerbations of the global trauma? Are we living in a traumatized society? In my view, my responsibility as an artist and a citizen of the global village is to be a voice that brings awareness to the collective human trauma inherent in the climate crisis, the migrant and health crisis. How can I, as an artist, contribute and support an equitable, collaborative, and diverse world? How do we relate to this global consciousness? How can we heal from the trauma it is suffering? I would argue that we are in a liminal stage where humans can either work together to build a fierce reverence for life or be condemned to follow a suicidal path to catastrophe. Historically, we are situated in a unique, pivotal, and uncertain place. COVID-19 has drastically changed our lives, but has also allowed for people to reflect, barring extreme cases where individuals are in complete survival mode. We no longer need to just contemplate and address our own struggles and mortality, but due to the climate crisis we have to contemplate the mortality of our entire planet. The painter Andy Patton writes, "I know too that I too will die, but to contemplate the worsening climate crisis, ring with denial and inaction, is to realize our whole cultural world will die." He reminds his readers of not only our mortality, but the death of our culture if we continue to deplete our resources. That is the death of everything we know and love. But perhaps this potential death could lead to the birth of a greater transformation. Summarizing the philosopher Brad Evans, power courses across borders. So the issues that we face in the 21st century are by definition global. As a philosopher and sociologist Zygmunt Bauman puts it, there are no 20th century solutions to 21st century problems. Will these predicaments catalyze sufficient transformation in enough individuals to create significant and meaningful change? Regardless of our individual or cultural understandings of morality, all human beings share the desire for meaning. All human beings share the desire for purpose. In my artistic practice, I want to investigate questions of meaning, purpose, and community in a world that is in constant flux. How can societies offer solace, coping mechanisms, and healing to satisfy the psychic need for something certain and solid? How do we deal with the crisis of meaning and isolation from the rest of community? Have we formed an overly individualistic, anthropocentric model of reality? And what is the price of human hubris? So I'm going to share a film, but I just wanted to give a warning because it does have flashing lights. So if you're epileptic or prone to seizures, you might just want to step away from the screen just for a moment. This 1-minute film is named, oh, sorry, if you've stepped away from the screen, you can step back. This 1-minute film is named Fragmentation. The audio is mainly composed of my breath. Each time you exhale, you have to let go, relinquish your life source before you take another breath in. In some way, each exhalation is a preparation for death. Breathing brings balance to the central nervous system. The inhalation activates a sympathetic nervous system, bringing energy, while the exhalation activates the parasympathetic nervous system, bringing relaxation. The breath out, the relinquishing, is what brings us to our deepest relaxation. Within the film, there is a heartbeat that serves as a consistent drum. The heartbeat expresses the human internal drum that drives us, sustains us, and is ultimately inseparable from our identity. Fragmentation explores these questions. How do we relate to our surroundings? How does ancestral history shape and form those relations? And how does that affect our identity? The animated images in the film are from a previous photographic series named Body as the Frame, in which I wear textiles I created from my own paintings. Creating a textile dissolves the restrictions of a canvas stretcher and allows me to create a mutable fabric. This fabric reacts to the natural forces of the wind and my body. And in a sense, the body becomes its own landscape. So I'm going to play another film. Again, it has the flashing lights. So if you need to, this would be a time to step away. So I know that that piece at some moments can be a little bit uncomfortable, but I also think that it is important as human beings to be able to sit with our own discomfort, because I think that that's part of growth. And sometimes when we sit with the discomfort, it can actually dissipate or teach us new lessons. So that sound piece was named Lacrimosa. Also, if you did step away, you can step back now. And this was part of a collective online exhibition with the intention of holding a virtualized ritual mourning for the pandemic. I digitally manipulated this melody using multiple different songs. And so I worked with digital manipulation and changed the speed, reversed, cut different moments of multiple various different things. The voices convey suffering and moaning, but are also reminiscent of a choir-like song. There's a sort of shared pain in the collective realities that we've all endured during this pandemic, albeit in varying levels, with some suffering more than others. The psychotherapist, writer, and soul activist Frances Weller said, "This is not my sorrow. This is our sorrow, our communal cup of sorrow that we are all sharing. Every one of us knows grief. Every one of us knows loss. None of us have been spared that reality. It helps us to break from the fiction of individualism. This is a shared reality, a mutually entangled experience, not only of sorrow, but of compassion." Furthermore, Weller argued, if you care at all about the world, your heart is breaking, and it should be. It's the broken heart that can fall back in love with the world. The visualizations in the sound piece of Lacrimosa serves to emphasize the eerie quandary. Its circular pattern represents the unending organic pulses within a rectangular structured frame. The frame creates a sense of structure which may be needed when you are diving into your subconscious, as the subconscious can be a deep and unregulated space. Structure allows for a tool to not get completely lost in the spatiotemporal realm. Lacrimosa is an invitation to that realm. Lacrimosa means Our Lady of Sorrows, weeping, mournful, tearful. The sound piece that I just played is inspired by the Requiem, or Mass of the Dead, pieces composed by Verdi and Mozart. Since COVID-19 has caused an estimate of 2.7 million deaths, a sort of Mass for the dead and mourning and grief feel essential. As Weller says, when we shun grief, the heart begins to freeze, and grief is a profound solvent. It can soften the most hardened places in our lives. Philosopher Brad Evans notes that COVID-19 has brought a mutually shared vulnerability, which in turn has put a spotlight on those who are truly vulnerable in our society. Those who faced economic and food insecurity long before the virus affected the world. He argues that the crisis has revealed what is already broken in our society. The idea of mourning ritual for our collective focuses on a mutual experience rather than an individual one. As Evans explains, the idea that politics begins with security is a complete misnomer. Politics begins with a concern for our loved ones, for our families, for our friends. So before we give any sense to the meaning of security, we need to know what love means. We need to know what compassion means. We need to know what empathy means, because that's what brings security really into focus for us. The Gothic mourning of Verdi's Lacrimosa captivates me, as it expressively juxtaposes the terrifying with the angelic. My Lacrimosa attempts to emulate the paradox of simultaneously holding the grotesque with the sublime. The piece also contains moments from the Mexican folk song La Llorona, a Mexican legend about a weeping woman who wanders looking for her lost children. My Lacrimosa embodies the mourning and wailing of La Llorona, and particularly it involves the line that says, Llorona, llévame al río, which comes from the Mexican song and means, Llorona, take me down to the river, the place where she looks for her children who have drowned. In The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, Carl Jung writes, water is the most commonest symbol for the unconscious. The river is not only a symbol of death in the Mexican legend, but also in Shakespeare's character Ophelia. It is also where Psyche, from the myth previously discussed, goes to commit suicide before meeting the god Pan. The river is unfixed, uncontrollable, fluid substance, much like our unconscious, especially when we are meeting new parts of ourselves for the first time. Perhaps, when in deep pain, we all retreat to the rivers of our unconscious. Writer and director Christy Nelson explains how we can be deadened to beauty and joy as much as we can be deadened to suffering and injustices. Sometimes we fail to see and be embodied witnesses. She urges her readers to always keep death before your eyes, as it may be the pathway to the deepest joy. So now I would like to read a few quotes from some brilliant thinkers. Death does not have to be treated as the enemy for you to delight in life. Keeping death present in your consciousness as one of the greatest mysteries and as one of the moments of incredible transformation imbues this moment with an added richness and energy that is otherwise used up in denial. Death is not an error. It is not a failure. It is taking off a tight shoe. Ram Dass. Feeling our grief is a reminder of our love and our profound interrelationship with everything. Even if we go extinct, being conscious of that, honoring reality in this process, as well as assisting trees, building topsoil, ensuring that our nuclear power plants don't melt down. There are many things that we can do even if we go extinct, which limits the harm that continues for millions of years. Michael Down. There is a climate urgency that might induce the feeling that we don't have time to take care of trauma. We need this urgency for the habits to change them, but we need to slow down to digest the past. We need both, and it is a paradox. If you don't deal with the trauma, it will slow you down anyways. If you don't slow down voluntarily, then you will be slowed down by all different kinds of events. Skillful intervention knows when to speed up and when to slow down. Just running is not the best solution. We need both. We need intelligent running, and we need intelligent slowing down. In the deepening of my understanding of life, death and birth are at the same moment. What is the meaning of death and birth not being a second apart? Thomas Hubel. So, in my view, it is a myth that the future is forthcoming, that the changes of our future begin at a different time. We can only dream for a better future when we fully embody the present and confront the contradictions of our past. Is it possible to allow for the injustices when we remember what it is to look into the eyes of another human and see the same essence that sustains us, that creates our own bodies? So how can we justify why some experience poverty, racism, unequal pay, neglect, while others do not? We cannot accept that this is the only way of the world. This is the way of the world because humans have made it so. We must choose not to submit, not to relinquish to old systematic ideologies because of convenience. I hope after hearing this talk, we can reflect and think, how can I, a member of the global village, make this dream a reality? How do I take personal responsibility and even the smallest step today? The world has changed through COVID-19 pandemic. The economic and ecological health crisis confronts us with a new reality never before faced by humanity. This forces us to consider a possible world, a better, freer, and more egalitarian world where we face our contradictions. If we are capable of truly accepting and understanding our past, then we will have a new world. During this pandemic, we have been taking informed, conscious steps, realizing that keeping our distance, covering our mouths, washing our hands, and the use of mass vaccination, we can control the COVID virus. Imagine if we use this mass global mobilization that we have seen during this pandemic to focus on solving the climate crisis. Excessive land exploitation, inequality, poverty, racism. I know that this sounds idealistic, but dream with me for a moment. So let's imagine that with sustainable production, we can manage to stop and reverse the deterioration of land, that every human being benefits, that there is no more ecological destruction and elimination of thousands of species, but that there is a change towards preservation and the conservations of species. Imagine a world without ecological and economical problems, where there is growth and peace and harmony. This world is only possible when we face our past, embody the present, and make a conscious change for the future. This is a world where human problems and their contradictions do not need to be resolved through war, but rather dialogue, where we can learn to actively listen to each other. No need to loot, steal, appropriate, or enslave. Great changes await humanity. These changes will not occur overnight, but we can begin to integrate these values and strive to make changes every day. We are all in this fight for change, but it is the young people who are most affected for the hope of a better world. I believe that we are in a transformative moment in which we can choose to allow the old systems that no longer function for us to die, mourn this loss, and strive for the rebirth, for a new world that is more sustainable, peaceful, and egalitarian. And that is my port talk. Thank you. I'm not sure if anybody has any questions.
First of all, that was an amazing talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what made you do the paintings where you have people and it's like photographed, but then they're on the black and white background.
Here, I'll share the screen again so we can go to those images. All right. So here we go. Sorry. They're much farther than I remember. So you're talking about these images, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you for your question. This actually, it was kind of interesting because these are actually my oldest pieces that I've showed here. The rest are made more this year, but these pieces, most of these are actually life size. And I originally started, this was kind of the first big project that I kind of decided to dive into. So these were actually quite old from my last years of high school. And what happened was that it was kind of a beautiful accident that I wanted to create a collage using my own photographs. And originally, I just kind of started sketching onto the photograph, kind of thinking, what could I place here, paint here? And then actually the graphite worked beautiful with the photographs. So I decided to make an entire series that were like life size of these images. Thank you for your question. Is there any other questions? I know it was a long talk, so I really appreciate everybody being here. I really appreciate it a lot. Thank you so much. Well, if there is no more questions. Oh,
sorry, I have a question.
Okay.
My microphone, but that's why I was taking a while. Can you expand more about the canvases of the images of the kind of that depict the kind of ripped up canvases, you know, the ones with the kind of the
sure
traumatic pieces that you talked about, because I found that quite interesting.
So do you want me to talk about the process or what exactly?
I think more about the kind of thinking behind them, I guess, again, just.
Sure, sure. So I talked about in the talk kind of collective trauma. And so at the time, you know, a lot of previous works, it was kind of your visual mind kind of works before the conceptual part kind of fully manifests itself. But this was actually the first time that it kind of reversed. And I was thinking about this collective trauma, and I was thinking, how can I express trauma in a visual way? How is that possible? And so, especially that moment, the wound, which means being open to the world, whether you like it or not. So there's something kind of beautiful about that, because it is that opening. So that was the idea behind these pieces. So, well, actually, I did start off with this. And what I did was I took an image and I ripped it and I scanned it and I kind of worked with it digitally. I printed that, painted on top of that print. So there's this idea that I was also trying to play with what is reality, because there's like physical body, that is the paper, the folds, but there's also painted space, and there's also digital space that I created on Photoshop before printing.
Mm.
So yeah, and this one, again, this one is fight, and it's supposed to be more chaotic, trying to manifest those defense mechanisms. So it's the fight, flight, and freeze. So this is supposed to be more chaotic. This was a real tear, but also the kind of body that it has is more emphasized by the painting. It's more of an illusion than it is. There is some form, but it is more of illusion than it is reality. And the freeze, the last mechanism, I decided to choose just this kind of more white space. So first I kind of ripped the canvas and I burnt it, and I burnt it inside my studio. Well, not my studio, my school. And then I actually, nothing was happening. So I decided to go outside with a water bottle and set fire to this canvas. And after that, I used the charcoal that the canvas created itself to kind of create those lines. And then there's little details that I went in with some like really white paint to kind of bring in a little bit of that contrast. But this one is like very different because it is freeze. It is the most motionless, but as the defense mechanism is. But there is that like little moment at the very bottom that you can see just a bit of color. So I was still trying to signify hope. And that's kind of what the color was supposed to mean for each one of them, is that despite there being trauma, there is still hope for change and growth.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting.
Thank you for your question.
Hi, that was amazing. This is Tallulah, by the way. I'm with Annabelle. Yeah, I'm really impressed by the range of your body of work and all the different mediums that you can work with. I'm curious what you're working on at the moment and where you see your practice going in the near future.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you. That was very kind. You know, actually, because of COVID, I've actually done a lot of interviews with different artists, and I found that that process was much more enjoyable than I was really expecting it to be. So now I am intending to make a film where hopefully I can interview different philosophers, some philosophers that I mentioned here. And I want to make a film on consciousness and what is consciousness, and really a lot of what this talk was about is I'm curious in how we can work to create a better future, and how can I participate. And sometimes I think every individual kind of goes through that difficult thing where you have your ideologies, but then you think, how do I as one person take an action? So I think my goal is to kind of ask philosophers and activists and people who are much wiser than me and their thoughts on this and what consciousness is. So that's the goal. And then I'm hoping to create all the visuals after I do the interviews. but that I think would take me about a year to make.
Yeah, well, I'd love to see that when you do that. That sounds amazing.
Thank you. Is there any other questions? Okay, thank you all so much. I really, really, truly appreciate seeing all of you guys here. It really warms my heart, and it's really wonderful to have dialogue despite this time that is more isolated, and to be connected in this way. And I really appreciate it. All right, well, let's say goodbye to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alondra. That was wonderful. Cheers.
Yeah, brilliant. See you later.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alondra. Congrats on that. See you around.
Well done, Alondra. Well done.
Thank you, Bea. This is also Bea who inspired me for so much.
Thank you. That's very beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I just hopped in the end here, but really good, Alondra. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Amazing artwork. Yeah, it's all really good.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.